Right now, as you read this, roughly 6,000 container ships are crossing the world's oceans. They carry the phone in your hand, the shoes on your feet, the coffee in your cup. Nearly 90% of everything traded globally moves by sea, packed into steel boxes, stacked on vessels longer than the Empire State Building is tall. And yet, almost no one can name the companies that move it all. Ask a shopper in Ohio who shipped their television, and you will get a blank stare. The industry is enormous, essential, and invisible. Here is the fact that should unsettle you. Just 3 alliances control the majority of container capacity on the 2 most important trade lanes on Earth: the Trans-Pacific route connecting Asia to North America, and the Asia-Europe corridor. On these lanes, these 3 groupings command well over 80% of the ships. They coordinate which vessels sail, when they leave, and how much space is available for cargo. The names sound bureaucratic. The 2M Alliance, the Ocean Alliance, the Alliance. Behind them stand a handful of carriers you have likely never heard of: Maersk, MSC, CM, ACGM, COSCO, Hapag-Lloyd, ONE. Together, these companies decide the physical logistics of global consumption. When they blank a sailing, factory orders sit idle. When they raise rates, the cost ripples into store shelves months later. This is the paradox at the heart of modern trade. We built an economy that depends absolutely on an industry the public cannot see, does not understand, and has no way to hold accountable. Governments regulate airlines, banks, and telecoms with armies of inspectors. But container shipping slips between jurisdictions, sailing under foreign flags across international waters that belong to no one. The result is a system that functions like a utility, but operates like a private club. To understand how a few companies came to command the arteries of the world, you have to go back to a single afternoon in New Jersey in 1956, when a trucking entrepreneur watched dock workers unload his cargo 1 crate at a time and decided there had to be a better way. That decision would change everything. On April 26, 1956, a converted tanker called the Ideal X pulled out of Newark, New Jersey, bound for Houston. On its deck sat 58 aluminum boxes, each the size of a truck trailer, welded to a reinforced frame. The man behind the experiment was Malcolm McLean, a North Carolina trucker who was tired of watching cargo handled piece by piece. Before that day, loading a ship meant longshoremen manhandling barrels, sacks, and crates for days. The cost of loading cargo ran around $5.86 per ton. McLean's containers dropped it to 16 cents. That is not a typo. Loading costs collapsed by roughly 97%. The standardized container did something profound. It turned cargo into an interchangeable unit that could move from ship to train to truck without ever being unpacked. In 1961, the industry agreed on standard dimensions, giving birth to the 20-foot equivalent unit, the TEU, still the measuring stick of shipping today. The box did not just cut costs, it rewired the planet. Once shipping became nearly free per item, it no longer mattered where a factory sat. A company could assemble electronics in Shenzhen, source parts from Malaysia, and sell in Los Angeles, all cheaper than manufacturing locally. Containerization made the global supply chain not just possible, but inevitable. Ports transformed. The bustling waterfronts of New York and London, thick with dock workers, gave way to automated terminals in Rotterdam, Singapore, and Shanghai, where towering cranes stacked boxes with robotic precision. Whole communities of longshoremen vanished, and the ships kept growing. The Ideal X carried 58 containers. Today, the largest megaships, vessels like the MSC Irina, carry over 24,000 TEUs, enough boxes that if lined up, they would stretch nearly 150 kilometers. This relentless scaling created a brutal economic logic. Bigger ships meant lower cost per box, but they cost hundreds of millions of dollars each. Only the largest carriers could afford them, and even they could not fill them alone. That single pressure, the crushing cost of ever larger vessels, would push fierce competitors into an uneasy embrace, pooling their ships and their routes in a way that reshaped the entire industry. By the 2010s, the container industry faced a squeeze it could not escape. A single, ultra-large vessel could cost $150 million or more. To justify that price, carriers needed to keep the ship full and running constantly. But no single company generated enough cargo to fill a fleet of these giants on every route, every week. The solution was radical. Competitors would share ships. The mechanism is called a vessel sharing agreement. Under it, rival carriers pool their vessels on a given trade lane. Maersk might operate the ship, but MSC buys space aboard it, selling that space to its own customers under its own brand. To the outside world, they compete. Behind the scenes, they sail on the same steel. This cooperation crystallized into three dominant blocks. The 2M Alliance, formed in 2015, paired the two largest carriers on Earth, Denmark's Maersk and Switzerland's MSC. The Ocean Alliance, launched in 2017, brought together France's CMACGM, China's COSCO, Hong Kong's OOCL, and Taiwan's Evergreen. And the Alliance united Germany's Hapag-Lloyd, Japan's Ocean Network Express, South Korea's HMM, and Taiwan's Yangming. Together, these three groupings control the overwhelming share of capacity on the Trans-Pacific and Asia-Europe lanes. The logic is undeniable from the carrier's seat. By pooling ships, they offer customers more frequent departures and more destinations, while spreading the enormous fixed costs across partners. A shipper in Vietnam gets weekly sailings to Rotterdam because 4 carriers combine their vessels to make that schedule viable. Alone, none could offer it profitably. But here lies the tension that governments have wrestled with for years. These agreements require competitors to sit in the same room and coordinate. They must jointly decide how many ships to deploy, which ports to call, and how much total capacity floods a route. That last power is the delicate one. Deciding how much space exists on a lane is uncomfortably close to deciding how scarce and how expensive that space becomes. Where does legitimate cooperation to run efficient ships end, and where does the shaping of prices begin? To answer that, you have to look at exactly how these alliances plan the ocean itself. Every week, planners inside the alliances perform a staggering feat of choreography. They map out loops, the fixed rotations a set of ships follows, port to port, week after week. A typical Asia-Europe loop might string together Shanghai, Ningbo, Yantian, Singapore, then through the Suez Canal to Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Antwerp before circling back. Building one loop can require 10 or more vessels sailing in sequence, each arriving as the last departs, so a ship leaves every 7 days. Under an alliance, those 10 ships come from different companies. The partners decide together how many vessels each contributes, which ports the loop calls, and the total slots available for cargo. Then, they divide the space. Carrier A takes 40% of the boxes, Carrier B takes 35%, Carrier C the rest. Each then sells its allotted slots independently to its own customers. This is the legal core of cooperation. Regulators have long accepted that jointly operating ships and sharing space produces genuine efficiencies. Fuller vessels, less wasted fuel, more reliable schedules. Within that lane, the arithmetic is clean, and it benefits shippers who need predictable weekly service. But there is a shadow that trails this coordination. When alliances collectively decide how much capacity to deploy, they hold a lever over supply itself. If they withdraw ships, a practice called blank sailings, canceling a scheduled departure, space becomes scarce and rates climb. Carriers insist this is prudent capacity management, matching supply to demand. Critics see something closer to a coordinated hand on the throttle of the entire market. The line regulators fear crossing is price signaling. It is one thing to agree on operations. It is another to exchange information that lets competitors anticipate each other's pricing or to trim capacity in unison until rates rise. In a normal industry, this kind of coordination among rivals would trigger antitrust investigations, dawn raids, and criminal charges. Executives would face prison. Yet for decades, container carriers did exactly this in the open. Protected by law, they could meet, coordinate, and pool their ships without fear of prosecution. That extraordinary shield did not appear by accident. It was written deliberately into statute, on both sides of the Atlantic, and it lasted far longer than anyone expected. To understand why shipping escaped the rules that govern almost every other industry, start in Washington in 1984. That year, Congress passed the Shipping Act, formalizing a principle that stretched back to the early 20th century. Ocean carriers could cooperate in ways that would be illegal anywhere else. The act allowed carriers to file agreements with a federal body, and once filed and unchallenged, those agreements were shielded from ordinary antitrust prosecution. Rivals could legally discuss rates and coordinate capacity. The historical justification was rooted in an old fear. Shipping was seen as ruinously competitive, prone to price wars that could bankrupt carriers and leave nations without reliable sea links. Governments believed that some cooperation stabilized an essential service. Europe embraced the same logic even more explicitly. Under EU competition law, cartels are strictly forbidden, but in 2009, Brussels created what is called the Consortia Block Exemption Regulation. It carved out container shipping consortia, permitting carriers to pool ships and coordinate operations without violating the bloc's cartel rules, provided their combined market share stayed below a threshold. The exemption was renewed repeatedly, treated as a settled feature of maritime commerce. On the American side, the 1984 framework was later refined by the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 1998, which deregulated pricing further, allowing carriers and shippers to sign confidential service contracts. The Federal Maritime Commission, the small agency overseeing all of this, was given a role that was more referee than enforcer. It reviewed agreements but rarely blocked them. The cumulative effect was extraordinary. For roughly 4 decades, an industry that moved the physical foundation of the global economy operated inside a legal bubble. Behavior that would land bankers or tech executives in handcuffs, sitting with competitors to coordinate supply, was not merely tolerated, but sanctioned by statute in the world's 2 largest markets. This was not a loophole, it was deliberate policy, defended by lawmakers who believed the alternative was chaos. For years, the arrangement drew little public attention. Rates were low, shelves were full, and the invisible fleet did its work unnoticed. Then, in 2021, the system delivered a shock so severe that it dragged container shipping onto front pages and into legislative hearings, and forced the world to finally ask who really controlled the ocean. In early 2020, the world's factories went dark. Carriers, bracing for collapse, canceled sailings by the hundreds. The industry calls them blank sailings. Then something unexpected happened. Lockdown consumers stopped buying restaurant meals and vacations and started buying furniture, treadmills, and televisions. Demand didn't crater. It exploded. And the ships weren't there to carry it. The result was the greatest freight rate spike in maritime history. In early 2020, moving a 40-foot container from Shanghai to Los Angeles cost roughly $1,500. By September 2021, that same box cost more than $15,000, a tenfold increase, and on some spot bookings even higher. A single container of goods now costs more to ship than the goods inside were often worth. Ports seized up. Off Los Angeles and Long Beach, a floating traffic jam formed. In January 2022, more than 100 container ships waited at anchor, some idling for weeks before a berth opened. Empty containers piled at inland depots, while exporters in the American heartland couldn't get boxes at all. Carriers, facing a shortage, prioritized the lucrative trans-Pacific backhaul, sometimes returning empties to Asia rather than filling them with lower-paying U.S. agricultural exports. Farmers watched soybeans rot. The alliances, which had spent the prior decade bleeding red ink, suddenly printed money. In 2021, Myers posted profits of roughly $18 billion. In 2022, the container shipping industry as a whole earned an estimated $300 billion, more than in the entire previous decade combined. Executives described conditions as extraordinary. Shippers described them as extortion. And the mechanism that made coordination possible, the vessel sharing agreements, the synchronized blank sailings, the pooled capacity across rivals, meant that when supply tightened, it tightened everywhere at once. Whether that was collusion or simply the market functioning under stress became the central question. No single carrier had to conspire. The structure itself concentrated the pressure. Retailers absorbed billions in surcharges and passed them to consumers, feeding the inflation that would define 2022. Politicians who had never heard the phrase supply chain now invoked it daily. For the first time in decades, the invisible fleet was visible, and the people who governed it began asking whether the rules written in 1984 could survive the age they had just witnessed. The backlash arrived fast. In June 2022, President Joe Biden signed the Ocean Shipping Reform Act of 2022, the first major overhaul of U.S. maritime law in decades. It passed the Senate unanimously, a rare bipartisan verdict in a divided Congress. The law's central target was detention and demurrage. The fees carriers charged shippers for containers sitting too long at ports the carriers themselves had jammed. Now the burden of proof shifted. A carrier had to justify those charges, not merely invoice them. The Federal Maritime Commission, for years an obscure 5-member agency, received sharpened teeth. It could launch investigations on its own initiative, demand carriers certify their fees were reasonable, and penalize refusals to carry U.S. exports. In 2023 and 2024, the FMC began pursuing cases, issuing rules on billing practices, and forcing carriers to answer for the boxes stranded across American ports. Europe moved differently. Since 2009, the European Union had granted container carriers a consortia block exemption regulation, a legal shield permitting vessel-sharing agreements that would otherwise violate competition law. After the pandemic windfall, Brussels reconsidered. In October 2023, the European Commission announced it would let the exemption expire. On April 25, 2024, it lapsed. Carriers could still cooperate, but now without automatic legal protection, each arrangement newly exposed to individual scrutiny. It was a symbolic and practical shift. The era of blanket immunity in Europe was over. Yet the harder question loomed beneath every headline. Enforcement requires jurisdiction, and shipping is engineered to escape it. A Danish-owned vessel, registered in Panama, crewed by Filipinos, chartered by a Swiss trading house, carrying Chinese goods to an American port. Which regulator truly governs that voyage? The FMC can police what happens in U.S. waters. The Commission can police European trade lanes. But the alliances operate across every ocean simultaneously, and no single authority sees the whole board. Fines that reach billions for tech giants remain modest against $300 billion in a single boom. Regulators had finally acted. Whether their reach could match an industry built to slip between borders was another matter entirely. And to understand why it slipped so easily, you have to follow the flag. Look at the stern of almost any megaship, and you'll read a surprising name: Panama. Liberia, the Marshall Islands, a Pacific nation of about 40,000 people that registers roughly a fifth of the world's tonnage. These are flags of convenience. A ship owner in Copenhagen or Geneva registers a vessel in a distant microstate, adopting its laws, its taxes, its labor rules, and its regulators. It is legal, deliberate, and ubiquitous. Over 40% of global tonnage flies just 3 such flags. The practice was born to cut costs. It survives because it fractures accountability. When a ship's ownership, registration, crew, cargo, and destination span 5 jurisdictions, no single government holds the full thread. A regulator in Washington sees a port call. A court in Brussels sees a trade lane. The vessel itself belongs, legally, to a shell registered on an island that may never see it. This is the jurisdictional gap the alliances live inside, not by conspiracy, but by design of a century-old system. Then there is the barrier of pure scale. A single 24,000 TEU megaship costs upward of $150 million, and a viable carrier needs dozens, plus terminals, chassis, inland networks, and the software to schedule it all. The three alliances already control the vast majority of Trans-Pacific and Asia-Europe capacity. A newcomer would need tens of billions in capital just to be ignored on the same routes the incumbents already share. Vessel sharing agreements let established carriers fill ships and smooth costs. A lone entrant enjoys none of that. The economics don't merely discourage competition, they foreclose it. And so the industry sits in a peculiar sovereignty of its own, too global for any one nation to discipline, too capital-intensive for any startup to challenge, too essential to be allowed to fail. The United States can push, the European Union can push, China can push. But each pushes only its corner of a network that reroutes around pressure, the way water reroutes around a stone. No single hand controls it, and that, precisely, is the problem. Which leaves the final question: what does dependence on this system actually cost us? Nearly everything you own crossed an ocean inside a steel box. Your phone, your shoes, the medicine in your cabinet, the parts inside your car. Roughly 80% of global trade by volume moves by sea, and most of that in containers routed by a handful of alliances. That is the quiet arithmetic of modern life. Convenience and low prices, purchased through total dependence on a system almost no consumer can name. In ordinary times, the cost is invisible. The alliances deliver goods cheaply and reliably, and the machinery hums beneath notice. But the pandemic revealed the hidden price. When the network tightened, it tightened everywhere at once, and there was no alternative to turn to. Prices tenfold higher, shelves half empty. Farmers unable to export while carriers chased richer routes. The concentration that makes the system efficient in calm seas makes it catastrophically fragile in a storm. Resilience and consolidation pull against each other, and for decades the world chose consolidation. The stakes reach beyond retail. A nation that cannot move its own goods in a crisis, that depends on foreign-flagged vessels routed by foreign-owned alliances, has surrendered a piece of its security. During conflict or blockade, the same network that delivers cheap sneakers delivers military supply chains, energy, and food. When the Ever Given wedged sideways in the Suez Canal in March 2021, it blocked roughly 12% of global trade for 6 days and stranded an estimated $9.6 billion a day. One ship, one canal, 6 days. That is the width of the margin. Governments have begun to push back. The Reform Acts, the expiring exemptions, the sharpened agencies. But regulation reaches only as far as jurisdiction, and this industry was engineered to slip between borders. The alliances are not villains in a conspiracy. They are the logical endpoint of a system that rewarded scale above all else, until scale became a vulnerability no single nation can fix. The true cost was never the price of a container. It was the fragility we accepted to keep that price low. Because in the end, the water that carries our world answers to almost no one. The ocean obeys a few hands.